been very busy filming, which is great news, and mostly for historic royal palaces, actually. So we are making a new series about Hampton Court Palace, which is usually my office, I like to call it, although in the past 18 months I haven't been there as much as I would like. And we're also in the middle of filming series 4 of Inside the Tower of London.
That was Tracy Borman, who's taking time out of her very busy schedule to join us to speak about her new book, Crown and Scepter. And she'll also let us know why now is the perfect time to be having this discussion.
Well, it's a very exciting time for me because my new book, Crown and Scepter, A New History of the British Monarchy, came out in the UK in November, and it's going to be out in the US at the beginning of February, which is perfect timing because that's exactly the time when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II celebrates her Platinum Jubilee. So a remarkable 70 years on the throne. And that was really the inspiration for this book, just to take a long look back at the history of the British monarchy and place the current Queen's reign into some kind of context, really. So it's been an absolute joy researching it, writing it, recently speaking about it, and I can't wait for it to come out in the US early next year.
Well, those of us in the US can't wait either. So many thanks to Tracy Borman for joining us. And I want to just jump right in as you have and start by letting people know right at the beginning of the book, which, by the way, those of you in the US who may not be able to manage to wait till February, there are some places, Blackwell's and Book Depository, where you can get it from the UK. So just know that, because that's what I did. But there is a marvelous sort of family tree in the beginning that starts with Egbert. So starts way back in time and traces all the way to Her Majesty the Queen. And so just take a moment, if you would please, and tell us what it means that there is this family connection running through this entire history of the monarchy.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that makes it unique. The British monarchy has this unbroken line for kind of 12 centuries. And I think that really struck me with that family tree. So I'm very pleased that you picked up on it. Just that sense of continuity, the fact that Elizabeth II can trace her descent to the Anglo-Saxon kings of England, and it's a direct line. And of course, huge amounts have changed during those centuries. But when it comes to the monarchy, an awful lot has stayed the same. So you just have to look at Egbert's coronation, the Anglo-Saxon king, the similarity with the ceremony used at his coronation and that used in 1953 for our current Queen is quite striking, even down to the music. And I think that's really what gets me excited about the history of the monarchy. It felt like a living history. The more I was researching it, the more I realized actually you only have to look at much of the ceremony surrounding the crown today to actually see history, in the making and as it would have been centuries before. So that for me was a real shivers down the spine moment, I guess, as a historian. Just, you've got to, whether you love or loathe the monarchy, you've got to respect that history and that sense of continuity that it has provided. It really is quite remarkable.
Well, that's a great point. And I know a few years ago when I was able to take a tour of Westminster, and they showed us for the opening of Parliament where the door is shut and the knock with the black rod knocks on the door, and the monarch is allowed to come in and deliver the address, and all of those steps that are still enacted or carried out today for the opening of Parliament.
Exactly. And just those little details, that, as you say, that they've been employed for hundreds of years. And you might say it's all empty and meaningless, but it does have meaning. It is rooted in history. And, so many times, I know you must be the same. You wish you could be a fly on the wall back at, say, the court of Henry VIII or whatever it might be. And these moments of ceremony give us that perspective. When you know that something has remained pretty much unchanged for centuries and it's still happening today, I think that's a real gift.
Right. And it is a wonderful opportunity, and to be in those places and know what happened and is still happening in those same places is really exciting. And
Yeah. Yeah.
what a wonderful way to look at it. And again, a million congratulations on this brilliant book. And I do want to ask a few questions about, your process and what you learned and maybe thought about in different ways as you were researching and working on this. And one of the things I'm wondering about is the monarch's personality. So a queen's or a king's personality. When did you see times when that made a difference in history? When it's not just the monarchy itself, but it's an individual whose personality really sort of changes history. I'm wondering if there's some times that sort of stand out.
That's such a good question, because it defined the monarchy for at least the first sort of 500 or 600 years. It was a personal monarchy. So the personality of the sovereign was all important. Particularly, though, I would highlight the reign of Henry VIII. Now, your listeners may say, of course she would say that, because she's Tudor mad. But this really was personal monarchy at its zenith, where the king shaped the history of his realm. And of course, Henry VIII was the most stridently self-confident monarch you can possibly think of, in public at least. I think privately he was a different man. But in public, he was shaping the identity, not just of the monarchy, but of England. He appointed himself supreme head of a new separate Church of England, breaking from Roman Catholic Europe, which was a huge step. We all get a bit obsessed with Brexit today, but Henry did it 500 years ago. And this was personal monarchy at its height. But the problem was that it made it a very, very difficult act to follow, because it so depended from that moment forward on the personality of the sovereign. And of course, that is something that's very difficult to control. And I think Henry's children struggled with that. But the child who did best and who emulated, and I would say improved on it, was Elizabeth, who has long been the sovereign I have most admired. She is still my top monarch. And she really was another shining example of personal monarchy. But I think she was also a great pragmatist, and I think she'd learned from the mistakes of her father and of her predecessors. But the thing was that then in the following century and the following dynasty with the Stuarts, the early Stuarts absolutely held true to this personal monarchy, and they also believed in the divine right of kings. But that was quite a dangerous belief. I mean, the power of Parliament is something that was beginning to really grow and be realized during the Tudor period. And the Stuarts, rather than working with Parliament, they asserted themselves over Parliament. And of course, that had disastrous effects and ultimately led to civil war and the execution of a king, Charles I, in 1649. Whereas the Tudors, they had been very personal monarchs, but they had respected Parliament. And that relationship is one that I would highlight as being the most important throughout the long history of the monarchy. How effectively a monarch handled Parliament was everything, really. And ultimately, it was Parliament who won that battle.
Well, that's a great way of comparing the Tudors to the Stuarts, at least the early Stuarts, and probably the male Stuarts really struggled with Parliament, I think we could say.
I'm pleased you picked up on that gender issue, because
Yes.
it's easy just to sort of lump the Stuarts into that kind of early male version
Mhm.
of Stuart
Mhm.
monarchy, but Queen Anne,
Mhm.
she was brilliant at what I would call PR, really. She appreciated the need to uphold those sacred traditions of monarchy, even though her political power was eroded. The monarchy was constitutional, it was subject to the authority of Parliament. But she knew that people still valued and respected those royal traditions and ceremonies, and she made sure that she upheld them to spectacular effect. So, for example, there was a rather odd ceremony known as touching for the king's evil. And the king's evil was the disease scrofula, a kind of skin condition. And there'd been this ancient ceremony whereby the monarch would sit enthroned, and a succession of his suffering subjects would be brought before him or her, and they would lay hands on that subject and cure them. Apparently, the royal touch would cure scrofula. Now, of course, perhaps there was the placebo effect. I don't know. It might have worked in one or two cases. It was obviously symbolic, but it was the sort of thing that people really valued. And Anne got that in a way that other monarchs hadn't, including her direct predecessors, her sister Mary and Mary's husband, William of Orange. They dispensed with all of this as being outdated and superstitious nonsense, but thereby disregarding just how much subjects cherished that royal touch, that royal mystique. And I think we're all still obsessed with that. Well, okay, that's a sweeping statement. I think monarchists and I think those interested in the royals still have that slight obsession with, they seem separate to us, don't they?
Mhm.
They don't seem like mere mortals in the same way as you and I. And I think therein lies the fascination.
Well, that's a great point, and I find the Stuarts fascinating in so many ways, but some of the Stuarts so misunderstood the role of monarchy or the role of Parliament or how to get along, and yet Queen Anne got it so well. It's just really
Mm,
interesting within that dynasty,
yeah.
how different, and a couple of times things really shifted
Mm.
because of a Stuart monarch, which I think is really interesting. I think we don't give Queen Anne enough attention in many
I, I
ways.
I agree, and it makes me so mad when she's just dismissed or characterized as the one who was pregnant 17 times, and
Hmm.
that's sort of the least, or one of the least significant parts of her reign. Yes, it led to change ultimately in the succession and an end of a dynasty, but she shouldn't be defined by her many pregnancies, really. I
Right.
think, as you say, she got it. She got it. She fulfilled her constitutional role perfectly. She was very dedicated to her royal duties and her constitutional duties, but she also got that mystique, that PR, that she understood what people valued and wanted. And so, yeah, we shouldn't just think of Anne as the one who was always pregnant, or indeed as the one who was dominated by her favourites.
Hmm.
There was a lot more to her than that.
Right, right. I think that's a really good point. And I find her to be fascinating. I really enjoy learning more about her. So that's great. Thank you. Now, speaking of this whole Stuart period, because there are some really important changes, and one of them, as you already mentioned, was the execution of a king. And I think sometimes we miss the significance of that. I mean, that was such a huge moment, and Parliament took over, and there was not going to be any more monarchy. But
Yeah.
that didn't last. And so I wonder, after Oliver Cromwell died and his son took over, and he actually is pretty interesting. Not that he's a monarch, but he sort of seemed
Mm.
to be as close to a monarch as he could get. I mean, he
Yes.
wanted to be called Your Highness, and he wanted his son to take over for him. But anyway, it didn't work. And Parliament decided to invite Charles II back to become king. Why do you think
Yeah.
that happened, and this notion of not having a monarchy didn't take?
It's so interesting, isn't it? That this was a real opportunity. This it was a turning point in British history. We were going to be a Commonwealth, and we'd got rid of a monarch. That was a very drastic step to execute an anointed king. And that should have been the end of the story and the beginning of the story of centuries of Commonwealth. Now, I'm going to draw a comparison here because here in London, for the millennium, if you can cast your minds back to the millennium, we built this dome, and it's now the O2 Centre, and it houses concerts, and it's become a success. But in the millennium, there was a huge focus on building this dome. This was going to be the big statement piece for the millennium. But it's a huge dome in Greenwich, in London, southeast London. But nobody really thought what to put in it. So all the focus was on building this dome, and then it was completed, and then they had to very quickly think, oh God, what are we going to fill it with? And it was a mess. It was a mess, quite frankly. Much as I love London and wanted to support it, there were a series of kind of failed things that went into it. It was a bit of a disappointment. And I would draw a comparison between that and the Commonwealth. All the focus had been on building the Commonwealth, getting rid of the king, but not with what to replace the king with, not the actual substance of the Commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell and his parliamentarian supporters very effectively and very ruthlessly managed to wipe out the monarchy. But then what did they replace it with? And as you say, what they replaced it with was pretty much a monarchy in all but name. Oliver Cromwell was styled Oliver P. For protector, in the same way as a king would be, Charles R for Rex, a king. He was served as a king. He was offered the crown. He did turn it down, but and as you say, then it almost became hereditary. It passed to his ineffectual son Richard, and so it basically completely mirrored the monarchy. And it's almost, there is a real sense that they just hadn't thought through, okay, we're going to get rid of the king. What are we going to replace him with? And that's the bit they hadn't thought through. And I think if they had thought it through better, if they had focused on the after and what was going to come after the monarchy, then perhaps we wouldn't have had the Restoration and Charles II coming to the throne in 1660 and Parliament inviting back the monarchy. I don't think we'd have had that, actually. So I'm deeply grateful that actually it did fail, because as a royal historian, we'd have missed out on another 400 years almost of royal history if they had got their act together.
Well, and it's interesting because they it's almost as if they tried the setup of the monarchy without the mystique and the magic and the family tradition and the history, and that didn't work. So
exactly. I think they dismissed that as being irrelevant. A later commentator described all of that kind of thing as froth and saccharine. It's all just, it's meaningless. Anybody who believes in all of that, clearly they need their head examining. They underestimated the power of all of that and how much people valued it. And so it was a sort of empty crown that they gave them. They gave them a leader in Oliver Cromwell and then his son. But it wasn't enough just to have a sort of political leader with none of the mystique, none of the sense of the God-given power. Now that is crucial in this God-fearing age, then to have a monarch who God has appointed. And all of that is reinforced at the coronation with the anointing. And that really mattered to people, the idea that, God has put this person on the throne. And then, of course, that was all lost because Oliver Cromwell hadn't been appointed by God. He'd executed a king. So that sort of sense of the sort of mystical and the religious aura surrounding the crown, that was lost now. And it was impossible to replace it with anything other than the son of the anointed king who'd been executed.
Right. That's such a good point. And I think the crown jewels, referring to the title of your wonderful book, Crown and Scepter, which Charles II insisted a time passed before his coronation so they could be recreated. So those crown jewels could be rebuilt after Cromwell and the others melted them down, which is just so horrible to think about, and took out the jewels and sold things off. He wanted those jewels back. That was such an important part of the
wasn't it?
presence of the monarchy, which I think
Absolutely.
is,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was
that's
such an
important.
important part. That symbolism after the crown jewels had been melted down by Oliver Cromwell, and that symbolism that Charles II, he got it as well. He understood
Hmm.
this. Throughout his reign, he always employed kind of symbolism and cherished the ceremony that he knew was essential to the crown, and commissioning a dazzling new set of crown jewels. That was a moment. The monarchy is back. It might have been emasculated, as one historian put it, by the kind of terms of the Restoration, which really deprived the monarchy of political power. But it still had that aura, it had that mystique, and that was now expressed in this glittering new set of coronation regalia.
So that brings us to another question. When this restoration happened and the mystique was returned, even if the power was, not the same, that's a
Mm,
really important turning point for the
yeah.
monarchy, for the history of the monarchy. What other moments do you see as being turning points
Yeah.
where things maybe go in a different direction?
I think, again, I'm so pleased you've highlighted these Stuarts, because, again, it's the Stuart period and it's not long after the Restoration. I would say it was in 1689. So 1688 is the Glorious Revolution, as it was called. So James II was the brother of Charles II, and he was his successor, because Charles II, much as he loved the ladies and had all of these numerous illegitimate children, he didn't have a legitimate child. So the throne passed to his brother James. Now, James wasn't willing to play ball. He didn't want to be dominated by Parliament. He wasn't very pragmatic, and he was a Catholic. Now, this was intolerable to Parliament, because part of the terms of inviting the monarchy back is that they wanted a Protestant monarchy, not a Catholic one. Well, James II, to give him credit, he's always dismissed as this kind of tyrant. Actually, he was very, very tolerant. But the fact that personally he had Catholic beliefs was unsupportable for Parliament. So they invited James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to come and take the throne, because William and Mary were devout Protestants. But actually, it was quite a small minority who did that. Quite often in history, you find this. It's presented as being the will of the people. Actually, it was the will of a small faction, a Protestant faction in Parliament, who invited William and Mary to take the throne. And a series of unfortunate events for James II meant that they succeeded, and he fled to exile. So that was 1688, but the really pivotal moment came the following year, because this is effectively when William and Mary had to sign on the dotted line. They had to sign this contract with Parliament known as the Bill of Rights. And this was the moment when Parliament made absolutely sure that from this time onwards, it was a constitutional monarchy. There would never be another tyrant on the throne. The monarchy would have no political power. And also the monarchy would be Protestant. And so that had an effect that reverberated down the centuries. And it really brought an end to the Stuarts, because we mentioned Queen Anne, the last of the Stuarts. She didn't have any children. Now, you could say that the throne could have gone back to James II and his descendants. He had sons, they had sons, but the problem was they were all Catholic. So the Bill of Rights, having said that it had to be a Protestant monarch, ensured that we went from the Stuarts to the Hanoverians, which was the next best thing. The electors of Hanover, Sophia, the Electress of Hanover, was descended from James I, and she was Protestant. So there was this kind of sideways move. The monarchy went from this quite strong bloodline to a watered down bloodline, I think it's fair to say, all thanks to the Bill of Rights in 1689. And they're still on the throne. Our royal family today still has this very strong German kind of heritage, all thanks to that moment.
Right. And that brings us a great way to the creation of the House of Windsor, which is actually a renaming of some of the descendants of the Hanoverians. So,
Yes.
so can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because the Windsors are on the throne now, but as you say, they're really part of another dynasty.
They are. That was a bit of rebranding on the part of the crown, because it was the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, very, very German sounding house, which was a problem when we had World War One. And obviously we were at war with Germany, and the royal family came in for a lot of criticism, thanks to its very strong German characteristics and the fact that the monarch for the past couple of centuries had married a German bride. It had a German name. So George V decided to put this to right. He was very, very conscious that the monarchy had a role to play in the sort of war effort. So in 1917, he decided to change the name of the royal house from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor, because Windsor is quintessentially English. Windsor Castle, you think of all the kind of Order of the Garter, and it's very, very English, or British rather. And so that's what George V decided to do. So it was from that moment, really, that it was rebranded. And I love the remark made by Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, who, when he heard of this, he said he would look forward to seeing a production of The Merry Wives of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha.
Oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah, that's not bad as a comeback.
Well, he shared Queen Victoria as their ancestor. I mean,
yes,
she really is at the helm when she's grandmother of Europe.
I mean, just extraordinary. 9 children she had, 42 grandchildren, and 87 great-grandchildren. And she made sure to marry her children and their children into the royal families of Europe. So it was with good reason that she was called the grandmother of Europe. Pretty much everybody was related to Victoria.
Yes, and there are some of images of those families, and I think of George V and the Tsar and how much they looked like each other, and the tragic way all that played out because they were so closely related.
Exactly. And that wasn't always a good thing, was it? It did lead to these conflicts of interest and loyalty when Europe was starting to head for war. There is that striking photograph, isn't there? It's probably the one you're thinking of George V with Tsar Nicholas. They look like twins, don't they? It's quite remarkable.
Yes, and you just think of, there's this happy moment they're together, and you think of where the history goes, and it's very sad.
It's incredibly sad. It's tragic.
Yes. Well, let's move on to some current happenings as the Queen prepares for her Platinum Jubilee, which is so exciting. And so, in addition to being the longest reigning monarch of Great Britain, she also is so adaptable. If you think of the changes that have happened since she took the throne in the 1950s to today, the world changes, the political changes, the economic changes, and some of the challenges that have popped up right in her own family.
I think that's where she's had the biggest challenges, to be fair.
Yes. So how has she managed to remain such a beloved figure? And when I hear people talk about, we've had enough of the monarchy, but after the Queen, I mean, everyone seems to think, don't touch the Queen.
Yes.
Even those calling, for a whole rethinking, just really seem to admire, respect, adore, in many cases, the Queen. How has she managed that over all these years?
You are so right. How has she managed that? And because I have talked to lots of Republicans over the years. My husband is a rampant Republican. He thinks we should just get rid of the monarchy. But he and every other person of that point of view agree that the Queen is great. So as you say, it's like, let's look beyond the Queen. They all love even those who hate the monarchy, they love the Queen, or they respect her. And I think that's the thing. She has been a constant, and she has provided that valuable sense of continuity in a rapidly changing, often frightening world. And I think what people respect about the Queen is her dedication to duty. Now, that is something I think she inherited from her father. She learned from her father, George VI, who took the throne out of duty when his brother, Edward VIII, abdicated. And so duty has been the watchword of our Queen's reign. And compare her to Queen Victoria. So obviously they both lost beloved consorts, beloved husbands. But when Victoria lost Albert, she gave up her public royal duties for more than a decade. When the Queen earlier this year lost Prince Philip, she was back at her duties after 4 days. And I think you can't help but respect that this is a woman in her mid-90s. And yes, she has recently had to kind of cede some of her duties to her son Charles and her grandson William, but to still be doing any duties at all,
right,
is quite amazing. And I think duty has been the defining characteristic of her reign. And I think that's why she commands so much respect and so much affection.
Well, and people seem to be so thrilled when she is able to appear and do her duties, whether it's on video. And I know some of her appearances have been on video, or her message to the country during COVID got
Yes.
huge response. So she
Yes.
really represents such an important duty-bound, duty-driven life.
Exactly. She really does. And I think people really still value that. And that's what I was thinking when you mentioned the pandemic there. It is a frightening world. And just that reassurance that she's been able to give. It's the same reassurance that her father was able to give during World War II, and George V before him during the First World War. Just that sense of comfort, of there are some things that don't change, and I think we all need a bit of a sense of that sometimes.
Right, right. And it reminds me as well of the Queen's mother, also named Queen Elizabeth, and during World War II, how she so publicly stayed in London and made that proclamation that the children wouldn't leave unless she did, and she
Yes.
wouldn't leave unless the king did, and the king would not leave under any
Yes.
circumstances whatsoever.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes. Exactly.
wonderful. And
Isn't
then
it?
she went and visited the areas that had been bombed, and Hitler considered her the most dangerous woman in Europe to his
Yeah.
goals.
Yeah.
That sense of what she represented, what the family represented
Yeah.
in difficult times, I think is so powerful. And I think the current queen certainly gets that from both parents, and that's really so wonderful.
That's such a good point, actually. Certainly, as I mentioned, from her father, but her mother too. And she was a trooper, for want of a better word. I mean, she really was. And actually, she said that famous sort of line about being glad when Buckingham Palace was bombed, so that she could look the East End of London in the face. The area that was worst hit by the Blitz. And talk about Blitz spirit. She had it in abundance. And so what role models really for the Queen? There's little wonder that she is still dedicated to her duties in her mid-90s.
Yes, and yes, such a remarkable legacy she has, and she has carried out on her own. Which
Absolutely.
which makes me wonder what you think, if this is a fair question, maybe not, but what do you think the monarchy will look like over the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, isn't it interesting and difficult as well? Impossible to predict. But what I think and hope is, the Queen has lit the way for her successors. There's a lot of talk over here in the UK about, what's the relevance, what's the purpose of the monarchy? It's not really got that much of a political role. They can advise, they can encourage, but they can't even vote, so they have less political power than their subjects. But where I think the monarchy absolutely has an integral role to play, it's twofold. On the one hand, as an advocate for good causes. And I think that's something that gives me hope for the future, because Prince Charles has been flying the flag for environmental causes for a very long time. And he used to be laughed at for it, but
Right.
people are now taking him seriously because, of course, this has been pushed much higher up the agenda. And ditto, his son, William, is also a real campaigner for environmental causes. So I think the monarchy can absolutely shine a light on the causes that really matter. And secondly, I think its role as a sort of head of charity, as a head of philanthropy, can really be something that forms an incredibly valuable contribution. The Queen is patron of more than 600 charities, and the directors of those charities are in absolutely no doubt. If you have a royal patron, it doesn't just double your income, it increases tenfold, sometimes 100-fold. So that philanthropic role, I think, is key to the future as well. So even if with Charles and perhaps with his son William, we have a monarch that isn't quite out of the same mold as Elizabeth II in terms of that kind of constancy, that that unflinching, uncontroversial. I think just advocacy and charity, if they stay true to those, then the monarchy, I think, still has a very pertinent role to play long into the future.
That's wonderful. I am really encouraged by that. I
Good.
certainly hope that's what happens. Thank you. Can we ask what you're working on now? I know you're doing an awful lot of filming about Hampton Court and about the Tower. What else are you working on?
So I am hoping that you're going to be pleased when I tell you that my next non-fiction book, which is out next year, and it's out in the States as well, hurrah, is going to be about Anne Boleyn. And it's going to be about Anne and her daughter, Elizabeth. So this is a whole book just exploring their relationship. Now, obviously, they only lived together or at the same time for less than 3 years. That's Elizabeth was 2 years and 8 months old when Anne was executed. But their relationship had a profound impact on Elizabeth for the rest of her life. It shaped her queenship. So this book will explore both women, but as a sort of interconnected story. So it's not a dual biography. It's purely about their relationship, the impact it had, and really how this relationship changed the whole course of history. Elizabeth was Anne's ultimate triumph. It's history's greatest irony that Henry VIII was devastated when Anne Boleyn gave him a daughter. He'd gone to all this trouble to marry her, and she just had a daughter. Little did he know that that daughter would go on to be by far his most successful heir. And realizing all of her mother Anne Boleyn's ambitions. So it's an absolute joy to be researching this subject. I feel like Anne Boleyn is following my every move at the moment. I'm spending a lot of time with Anne Boleyn. And as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth is my all-time historical heroine. So what a joy, what an absolute joy I am finding this.
Well, I had heard that before, and so I am thrilled and eager for any mention of this upcoming book. So thank you for letting us know about that. That's so exciting, and I cannot wait. So I'm thrilled.
Oh, thank you. And
Now,
obviously, I would love to come back and talk to you about it once it's out.
oh, good. I was just going to ask. So, so now a reminder to everyone as we're waiting for the new book that we do have this marvelous book right now, Crown and Scepter, out soon in the States, out in February, which is the month that the Queen will celebrate her Platinum Jubilee. So it could not be more timely. But if you're just too impatient, again, you can reach out to some British publishers for Crown and Scepter. Now, I believe that the audio version will be out in the States around that same time. And did I hear correctly that you are reading the audio version?
You did hear correctly, and I'm delighted to say so. This is the first of my books that I have personally narrated. So I think it's my 14th book, and it's taken me until now to record one. And I was quite daunted about it. I mean, quite apart from anything else, it's a long book, and so kind of just under 500 pages. And so, but I loved it. I loved doing that narration myself. It was a real privilege, and I saw the book in a different light, because usually, you see it on screen, you're fed up at the sight of it by the time you've finally finished it. There have been edits and copy edits, but reading it brought the story alive in a different way for me. So yes, it's my own voice that listeners will hear, and I really, really hope that people enjoy it.
Well, that is wonderful. And I know for a personal fact that you can pre-order that on Audible right now. And I have.
You're great. You have got. Yeah, I need to start paying you commission, because you know all of this, and it's fantastic. So thank you for letting your listeners know.
Well, I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled with all of this news. And I want to thank you, Tracy Borman, for spending this time with us, for taking us through all of this history in your wonderful book, The Turning Points in the Monarchy, and the way that the English and British monarchy have survived and adapted and continued to be relevant in different ways, and for sharing these exciting new discoveries about Anne Boleyn and your new book on Anne and Elizabeth. We just can't wait. And I know I just can't wait. So thank you so much for being with us.
Caroline, it's been the greatest possible pleasure. Time never goes so fast as when I'm chatting with you. So I've hugely enjoyed it. So thank you ever so much for having me back.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much to Tracy Borman for joining us and sharing so many wonderful stories about history, about the monarchy, all the way from William the Conqueror to Her Majesty the Queen. My mom always told me to try and make January a month of favorites, and we are off to a great start. Thank you so much for listening, and let's keep shaking up history together.